Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to another edition of Clearing the Air on Agricultural Policy. This is a monthly presentation of the Barry Flinchbaugh Center for Ag and Food Policy, and it is a spin-off of a regular podcast that happens weekly that's called Smoke and Mirrors, which is hosted by one of our guests, or one of our panel members, I should say, whom you'll hear from as she speaks with our guest in just a moment. We are going to tap into today a highly informative resource regarding agricultural policy, and it has been for a number of years now. And we're going to learn more about what's on the front burner there. What we're referring to is something called the Food and Agriculture Policy Research Institute out of the University of Missouri. It so happens that we have the director of that institute with us in our fold today, and we're looking forward to a conversation about what's going on in ag policy and what that institute in specific is centering on as it pursues its research. Before we do that, though, I'd like to introduce our entire panel. Joining us a bit later for the conversation will be Brad Lubin, Associate Extension Professor and Agricultural and Public Policy Specialist at the University of Nebraska. Also joining us, as always, Mark Edelman, Professor Emeritus and longtime Agriculture and Rural Policy Specialist at Iowa State University. And last but not least, Associate Professor and Extension Specialist and the Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair at Kansas State University, Jenny If. Jenny will be speaking with our guest in just a moment and getting us going in the conversation, but I want to tell you a little bit about him first off. And he is in agricultural circles, Seth Meyer. Seth is the director of FAPRI, as it's known for short, and a professor of agricultural and applied economics at the University of Missouri. Prior to his return to FAPRI, Seth was appointed the USDA Chief Economist and served from January of 2021 through December of 2025. FAPRI, well known for its agricultural policy and market analysis. Seth was previously then the head of the World Agricultural Outlook Board at the USDA, and that was charged with bringing together USDA resources in the assessment of crops throughout the world. And previously, Seth, as we go down his resume, served as an economist with the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. He's been a visiting scholar at several research institutions around the world. He grew up in eastern Iowa, has a bachelor's and master's degree from Iowa State University, and his PhD from the University of Missouri. Jenny, we'll turn it on over to you now to start the discussion with Seth.
Okay, all right. Seth, thanks so much for joining us. Excited to have you here. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about your background before we
No,
get
it
started?
sounds much nicer when he reads it. So I sounds much more impressive when when he reads it
Okay.
all out. It sounds great.
Okay, I didn't realize you went to Iowa State, but we won't hold that against you.
I did. As a matter of fact, while I was there, my parents had gotten over it, and there had been somebody in my family there for about a decade, and so it was basically bye. We'll see you in 4 years, kind of a situation. So yep. So I'm a proud Iowa State graduate.
Very nice, very nice. First of all, before to set the stage, could you tell us about the history of FAPRI and its current purpose?
Yeah, so FAPRI's in the last few years we celebrated our 40th anniversary. The group's origin comes from some folks departing USDA many years ago and the need for policy analysis tools available to Congress. So that Congress would have a resource to reach out to folks to get an unbiased but detailed opinion on the effects of certain policies they might propose. Historically, the business was very much kind of on this farm bill cycle where, farm bill comes up. You would do analysis for proposed changes in farm bills as you might start off slowly and things would get intense and you'd get many asks. But over time, it's evolved into other asks as well, too. We get asks on biofuel policy, which some of you might have heard about the report we did, and I'm happy to talk about it. But it's the whole reason it exists along with the other two PRCs is to be a resource and access for the Hill to ask questions about what policy effects might be. And then very specifically, the way we do it, all of this comes down to in the farm bill, how much does this cost over a 10-year baseline for the government, right? That's one of the oftentimes one of the criteria. So when we do analysis, a lot of the things we report, a part of it's for that very reason. It should give you an idea of what the government cost is with it.
Right. So FAPRI is referred to a policy center often, and it's not the only policy center. Could you speak a little bit more broadly about what a policy center means?
Yeah. So again, we talk about, hey, this is a very broadly, this is a resource to do policy analysis and respond to the Hill and the administration and other folks who might want to have a better understanding of proposed policy. We do this. We have sets of kind of when we think about what our focus is, we have sets of structural model at a national level or at a state level, and we look at national and regional effects of proposals from the Farm Bill. But there are other policy centers who may focus more on other aspects of policy or more details of policy. Our colleagues at Texas A&M University, for instance, they have a whole suite of representative farms. And so while we may talk about here's the expectation for corn prices over the next 10 years, they will take that down to a farm level and talk about how this changes the profitability at a farm level. So they focus more on representative farms and farm simulated representative farms to look at how policy affects things at the farm level. And then we've got another group of colleagues at North Dakota State University, and they do lots of different things, but trade and crop insurance are two of the areas where they have some emphasis.
Hey, great, great. Thank you. Thanks for that overview. Um, I also it sounds like a lot of your work is directed towards legislation, towards policymakers. Is some of it directed towards the public as well?
Well, yeah, I think it informs the public as well, too, right? So interestingly, the first line might be you have policymakers who want to experiment with some different policies and try to understand both what are the effects going to be and what are the costs going to be for their own purposes. So sometimes, and this is tough to do in an academic environment. You might do a whole lot of work that never sees the light of day because this is kind of their experimentation lab, right? We are in some ways, sometimes their experimentation lab. They will ask us, well, what about this combination of things? And then you'll provide it to them and they may very well say, well, I don't like that. We're not going to do that. So you may, in an academic environment where you say, well, this was an interesting question and look at all this work we put in. From a policy center perspective, we're their experiment lab, and that may be the first place, and it may never go anywhere beyond that. And then other times it'll be, hey, give us these, look at this policy and provide us a public report. And so I think it is, when we look at, might as well talk about it a bit, the E15 report that we put out several days ago, it isn't as if it's my desire to go out and do policy analysis so I can get my name in the paper. I don't like having my name in the paper, as a matter of fact. And if you read through the report, you can look very clearly that it never says what the policymakers should do. It doesn't say anywhere in that. And then also it's very narrowly couched in the framework of what does this piece of legislation say? Not what past successes or challenges have been and not what future successes or challenges might be as a result of the policy. It says, here's what the policy effect is. And so that's part of that, when folks were asking us do this and release this, it's to put some information out into the public in terms of what is this piece of legislation actually saying and talking.
Can you walk us a little bit more behind the scenes? Like sort of how you were you asked to do that? How long did it take? How did you release it? What does your process look like?
Well, so when you think about some of these policy proposals, sometimes you have a model which can handle whatever it is you're being asked for. We've got a very complicated system in order to say we're going to look at very specific aspects of farm policy. So we have, like, for instance, if you want to talk about Title I programs and Title I program effects, that is our bread and butter and systems to do this. And if somebody asks us, hey, we want to make some changes to the Title I programs, for instance, a lot of the provisions in OBBBA change aspects of the Title I program. We may have to make major overhauls to our system, or it may just be minor tweaks. And that will depend also, that'll determine how fast or how complete we can respond. But it is really the folks asking us that give some determination about when do we want this by? Okay, we're having a negotiation. We want it tomorrow, or give us a bit of time. The markup for the Farm Bill will be next month. You got several weeks in order to do this. It is really, each question ends up being unique in whether the system can handle it or not. Very few times is it something only like, let's talk about what if we change reference prices by a dime? That's not usually what folks ask. It's usually that and then much more complicated.
All right, could you talk about your vision for the direction of FAPRI and how your experience as chief economist of the USDA has played a role in that?
Well, yeah, I don't think that for one thing, I don't think FAPRI has to be reimagined. We just need to be able to keep doing what folks have been doing very well for more than 40 years. So I don't think we have to re-envision what we're doing. I think we always have to refresh ourselves in terms of what policies are being pushed forward, what's likely to come on the horizon. How would we handle that if such questions were to arise? So I don't think that there's anything really reimagining of the play. I don't think that the place has to be reimagined. I think being chief economist was probably some good training to follow up with Pat at FAPRI as well too, because at USDA, the of Agriculture has her sub cabinet. Everyone on the sub cabinet, but the chief economist is a political officer, except the chief economist. And so, the job at USDA was often, hey, this is how it actually works. And that's often what the FAPRI job is as well too. This is how it actually works, or at least how we think it works, or how it's described in the legislation. You decide if that's actually what you want to accomplish. It's up to the policymakers to decide those things. So I don't think we need to reimagine how we do things. We just need to make sure we are on our toes in terms of what's likely to be proposed.
All right, that's great. All right, so I think we can open up for panel discussion now.
Okay. Well, tell us a little bit of a summary of your E15 report that you just released.
Yeah, no, and so it's tough. There is a piece of legislation, if I get the number right. If you look at the title is if you were trying to advertise yourself, you would not use that lengthy long title, but it's there for a specific reason. This is HR 1346. This is looking at the primary elements of this piece of legislation. And so when you look at these primary pieces of this legislation, it includes E15, year-round E15 changes legislatively that make some changes to how EPA would regulate E15 that allows you to use it year-round, not force you to use it year-round, but potentially use it year-round and expand E15. But that's not all that's in there. What is also in there is small refinery exemption rules. And we can get into the detail here, but what it is it's a de facto lowering of the renewable fuel standard. So it's saying, okay, the renewable fuel standard might be here, and this would be a de facto reduction in that volume. So it is a cutting of demand for biofuels. So when you look at this E15, the mandate set the overall volume of biofuels that will be consumed in the current. So when you allow for more E15, the basic principle is if you consume more E15, you need less biodiesel, right? There's an offset there. If it's just E15, there's an offset. If I'm using more ethanol, I need to use less biodiesel. Okay. And I think when you look at this environment, what you have corn constituencies and soybean constituencies, and I think that I'm an Iowan. Those are the same people in Iowa, right? Those are the same people. And so when you say it's a trade-off, and maybe we're trading off between kind of our receipts from two different crops a little bit, but we get this potential for E15. And so I think even when you look at like what the American Soybean Association will say things like, we're for E15. They're not opposed, even though more ethanol means less biodiesel. I think the rub comes in that order to get this passed, what the petroleum side of the negotiation has said, we want small refinery exemptions, which are a de facto reduction in the overall mandates, which means, and that's going to fall largely on biodiesel. And so the soybean folks are saying, well, wait a minute, what you're trading off over here in petroleum is going to be a negative for us. It lowers overall biofuel volumes, and that's a net negative for farm income. And it's a net negative for government expenditures rise under Title I programs. So that's where we end up. So it's trying to explain to folks, this isn't just a clean E15 bill. This is E15 plus this reduction in the renewable fuel standard.
And Seth, to clarify that a bit further, you're specifically analyzing what was proposed.
Yes, and that's why that title, it says HR 1346, right? That's what's in the bill that ultimately passed the House.
Yeah. And you're not assuming things that haven't happened yet, which might mean if you adopt and you raise the mandate to go along with the increased capacity, then maybe biofuels use goes up. Well, that's not part of the analysis because that's not explicitly what was proposed or assumed.
No, absolutely, and that's what's a bit tricky, I think, when folks kind of, to some extent, poke at the analysis. They'll say, well, you did this in February, and in March they had a higher renewable fuel standard. And I said, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about what the effects of the the legislation are. So
Yeah.
when folks look at this, and with the small refinery exemptions, you're talking about maybe some decline in commodity prices overall, some decline in farm receipts, especially in those mid years before E15 takes off. That doesn't mean you shouldn't necessarily say that's a deal worth making. That's for policymakers to decide, because they may be saying, well, hey, this is a getting E15 year round is, in math we like to say a necessary but not sufficient condition, right? We need this because next step is we're going to do this other thing. Well, we don't measure what that other thing is. We're just saying, hey, here's what your current trade-off is in this legislation.
Is there temptation, Seth, to want to take it to that next level, to extrapolate it further on down the line?
Yeah, I mean, there's always because it's temptation. So it's kind of like going back to, and again, go back to my training at the WASDE report, and you guys, this is no policy involved, but when we do these things, we say, well, normal weather from now on. And you go, well, it's awful dry. Should you be assuming that? Well, we're going to assume normal weather. There's always this temptation to say, well, I know something that is unknowable and isn't really in my model. But you try and come up. Part of the reason, we say, hey, here's E15 and here's two different levels of small refinery exemptions, because that's two different ways it can turn out. And as a matter of fact, you say, well, but maybe the mandate expands. Well, when you kind of go through the details as well, too, we say, hey, we have an E15 expansion path that we just kind of assumes happens because we don't know what all the factors are that are key, because we don't have any economic observation of this. So we're saying this happens and it actually exceeds 15 billion gallons. And so, trying to say, hey, here's some different plausible ways that this can turn out, so that folks can find pieces that they say, okay, I understand this. I agree with this aspect of I like what this piece of the legislation does, or I don't like what this piece of the legislation does. So no, there's always a temptation. There was always a temptation at the WASDE report to say, hey, what's the next step?
So are you assuming normal policy? And if so, what is that?
This is a great question, because we debated this strongly. So you say, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds on biofuel policy, but stated EPA standard operating procedure at the moment, and that's what's important at the moment, is to say, how much biodiesel can we produce without kind of disturbing all of the veg oil markets, and how much ethanol can we consume? Bam, there's the total. That's what the mandate is. That's their standard operating procedure. So when folks say, okay, you start with that number, and then you make obligations to all the individual people, and then you divide up, okay, here's our target, and we're going to divide that up against all the individual people. Well, if you let some of those people out of that obligation, by definition, you are lowering the target. But everybody says, well, EPA could cheat. They could cheat because they know if you're going to give these people an out, you could raise the overall total. Well, that's tempting and possible, but you kind of gotta, you're making an assumption that EPA is going to follow current standard operating procedure. So these are the kinds of things you have to struggle with in evaluating these policies.
So if a farm bill has not been, have you ever had to assume that if a farm bill's not reauthorized, have you ever been caught up in one of those cycles?
You mean in terms of the return to? No, we had to do that at EPA. I mean, at USDA before. So what does standing law mean, and dairy cliff and everything else? And I think that so we would do lots of those kinds of back of the envelope, not at FAPRI, but at USDA, and those were usually shocking enough that nobody actually wanted that to happen, right? But you'd get close enough that you'd start the work and say, here's what we're going to do. What's our plan going to be? And then you start doing those calculations of what does this mean in the dairy sector? And that usually was pretty motivating, which is, I think, the whole reason why it was existing there anyway.
Sort of a follow-up question to that. I think there's one economist that suggests that we do away with or modernize the permanent legislation. And so my question to you is, how would that change? How do you think that would change the policy environment in Washington? Or is that something that you would that may not be a question you could simulate very well?
Well, no, it is. I mean, and I guess the thing is okay, if you remove the kind of the permanent law, and what is the what is the farm bill still only authorized for 5 years, or is it? It's going to be. You know what I mean? Is it still, if it's authorized for only 5 years, and after 5 years it ends, or it's automatically extended? If you did something which says, hey, we're going to put something new in place until we change it again, that probably lowers the motivation to do anything. I mean, part of the part of the permanent law is the hammer to actually come out every 5 years and trying to make something happen. That's the hammer. So if you don't take away the hammer, do you really change the dynamic to make changes?
Seth, I'd like to ask a different scope of questions based on your experience. Now at FAPRI, back at FAPRI, you have the responsibility of publishing the annual or semi-annual baseline forecasts along with these other studies that come out. In your prior role at USDA as the chief economist, you oversaw that contract with FAPRI to do that work, but you also had the responsibility of publishing USDA's 10-year baseline forecast as well.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about the role of the 10-year baseline? We have forecast, but it's an important indicator of economic and policy direction. Can you talk about what a baseline fundamentally is for?
Yeah, and so I think we all know it's
how it compares at USDA and at FAPRI?
Yeah, and in both instances, this is for budgetary purposes. It is not necessarily to say, I know that the price of corn in 10 years is going to be $4.38. It's not for that, right? We spend a lot of time, and enjoyably, because I like it, we spend a lot of time trying to say, hey, let's get the first few year dynamics right. Because the first few, they do matter when we start thinking about things like government costs and ARC and PLC payment triggers. It's important. And it's important to kind of say, hey, what do things look like going forward? It's not a forecast, but you try and incorporate in there a lot of the underlying drivers when you're thinking about that period of time, whether you're at USDA or whether you're at FAPRI. So you say things like, hey, China's importing, 6, 7, 8 million metric tons, or, what's the pace of Chinese imports of soybeans? Will that continue? The Brazilians, you can take that kind of increase in Brazilian production when you have that kind of growth in Chinese demand for soybeans. But now what does that look like over the next 10 years? Do rations of swine start to normalize in China? Does their demand soften? Does Brazil start slowing its growth? Are we less competitive? Are we more competitive? What are the drivers here over the next 10 years that'll really talk about the economic conditions that we'll find ourselves in? And then we do this at USDA and at FAPRI much differently. We would also do things stochastically. So you think about, whenever you look at a baseline, you've got this nice smooth path out there. We know that's not what happens, just from yield variation. So we try to put in both those underlying trends, those underlying drivers, and then also add to it a bit of uncertainty, not full uncertainty, but uncertainty in yields, in trade dynamics, in consumer demands, and try to put that in there and say, okay, these fluctuations are also going to drive government costs, whether it's through ARC and PLC payments, whether it's through crop insurance, whether it's through, other aspects of farm programs. So, these are tools where you say, okay, here's the underlying drivers. Here's where the underlying drivers push us over the next 10 years. And so that provides us a base for which, when we change policy, we can do the analysis. These are really tools that say, here's the drivers, how things could evolve. But if we change something, what's the change? And so you see in our E15 report, it's all reported as a change. It's all reported as a change from the policy. That's what it exists for.
Yep. And every analysis of a farm bill proposal is talking about change relative to a continuation of the existing programs, right?
Yeah, and you have to be. I mean, you have to be. You need both to be thoughtful about what price pass you're assuming, and to have the stochastics, because we can think about ARC and PLC payments. If you're in the money or whether you're out of
Right.
the money, makes
Right.
a big difference on whether you have government costs or not, right? And so, where you set that is not irrelevant. And part of the game here, the game is when folks are doing the farm bill, we'll go back to, well, why do you do all this? Because they'll often say, well, this provision costs this much. And if we change, or current provision is here, and if we make this change, it'll cost us X millions or billions of dollars. And so this is really a tool for Congress to say, what does this change actually cost?
Hmm.
The ultimate decider of what the price tag is CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. So it's kind of a funny thing. I know the CBO folks well, and we interact. So it's kind of always a debate. Do you want to try and mimic what CBO is doing, or do you want to be fancy and try and mimic the market more? And so there's always a challenge there as well, right? That's the whole kind of the bottom line there is they have to cost these things out in policy terms.
Now, one of the questions I've had is FAPRI has focus on domestic farm policy, but how does international trade policy integrate into the models that you use? Or is it just domestic trade policy decisions that you work on adjusting that Congress would ask you to evaluate? Or give us a sense of how those fit together.
Yeah.
Your model.
So I don't know how technical to get here for you, but like an Armington trade model isn't what we do. We don't measure bilateral trade between a whole bunch of countries when we do our international modeling. A lot of the things that we model, you'll have some representation of different ways that price transmission goes into different countries. And so I think we don't maintain a big Armington model where we explicitly say we are going to send this many billions of metric tons of soybeans to China. But when it becomes a question that we must answer, we figure out a way that we want to adjust this so we can say, okay, is it 25 million metric tons of soy? Is the deal 25 million metric tons of soybean plus $17 billion of other stuff? Or is it $17 billion of stuff, including 25 million metric tons of beans? And how do we measure this? And how do we measure the effect on our U.S. overall trade, even though we don't explicitly in our system have a trade equation that says this many beans goes from the U.S. to China? So we may have to do this kind of gets back to the question we were talking about earlier. Does your system answer every question that folks have? No. Sometimes you have to modify it, add to it, think about what the key elements are, make some changes, and then run it. And I think the China trade deal is one that we're spending some additional time on now. And we might draw in our colleagues at the other PRCs. For instance, the North Dakotans have a lot of skill on looking at bilateral trade, but don't have the skill to the tools to look further down within the U.S. ag sector. So we'll combine our efforts here to say, how can we have these two systems talk? Let's talk about what this trade deal actually means. For what commodities is it largely additive, and which commodities is it largely displacement for other trade destinations, and what does the result overall mean? That was a long answer to your question. I apologize.
Do you try to anticipate major policy shifts so you're ready when you get the questions?
That's like it's a very difficult part of it is, but you have to think about what are folks asking, and to me that's the listening to what folks are bringing up. What are they saying? What are the potential questions that will come down the pike? And for instance, I joke that so I was up at the Iowa Renewable Fuels meeting, and we were talking about 45Z tax credits. I don't know how much you guys know about the blender's credit for biofuels. And folks were saying, I was joking that Treasury said they anticipate including USDA's rules for farmers and how farmers might benefit from this. So to me, that says, okay, you use two things. Anticipate. Well, okay, if we're going to anticipate, we're going to use USDA's rules for 45Z tax credits, or we're going to anticipate that imported feedstocks for biofuels are only going to get half of the credits. Well, we better figure out how we're actually going to handle that. And then the cynical side of me says, anticipate is a DC word for that's probably not very likely we're actually going to do that. I joked in Iowa that I said, if my wife asks me to stop and get eggs and I say, I anticipate that I will get eggs on the way home, that's not going to go over very well, right? And so, there's two L. You got to kind of look and see what that means, but you better be ready for that kind of analysis. Again, because biofuels are on my mind. The EPA says, well, we're going to kick that can of half RIN credits for imported fuels and feedstocks down the road to 2028. Well, okay, that's going to come up. Anticipate what that answer is going to be.
One thing you mentioned earlier with E15 is that char, was it 1314?
1346, I think.
1346. All right, I got to get better at this. That it would you projected an increase in government expenditure
Over 10
for
years.
Title One. So if we could speak maybe more policies that increase demand, so biofuel, biodiesel, E15, all that. It sounds like that those are not necessarily going to decrease safety net spending.
So
Have you looked into that much?
I think when you go back, so the first thing is you said, so policies which increase demand. I would argue demand is set by the mandate. And so when you allow for E15, you're not really changing overall demand. You're saying, I'm going to use more ethanol and therefore I don't have to use as much biodiesel. And that's with clean E15. And then further, you cut demand when you start saying, and then if we follow standard operating procedure by EPA, we're going to cut the mandate. So you're cutting domestic biofuel demand. You might still see with E15 corn prices rise a little bit and bean prices fall, because bean prices are the ones that are subject to a lot of the pressure of the cut. And so then you're saying, okay, we might have a little bit of savings on the government side for corn, but we're going to see bigger expenditures on soybean.
Okay. Oh, that was a little bit different than I was thinking about it. But I mean, when you have a policy that leads to increasing crop prices, you still have our crop insurance guarantee includes prices. I'm curious if you've ever played with those levers.
Yeah, and this gets back to why we do this stochastically as well too. So anything which raises the price of corn should lower the government expenditures on ARC and PLC. And it also depends on how close to the trigger you are when you start. And that's why the baseline's not irrelevant, right? The baseline's not irrelevant. So, when you start raising commodity prices, you start cutting government expenditures on ARC and PLC with some offset that expenditures on crop insurance rise because the liability rises with crop prices, right? And so you do have a little bit of an offset there in terms of how government expenditures move. And the reason we do it stochastically is because if we did a price forecast where prices were just running just above the reference price the whole way out, you'd say, well, the cost is zero. Oh, that's not true, right? Stochastically, you will see some years with good yields, some years with bad yields, some year with good demand, some years with poor demand. And so this causes you need to look at the distribution of those prices. And again, where you are relative to the trigger is not irrelevant.
Seth, that reminds me of a more than a decade old situation. ARC and PLC were first introduced in the 2014 Farm Bill, and producers had that decision for the first time. We now have an annual decision. And even today, producers will still have that fundamental sort of debate of, well, if the price forecast is just above the trigger level, then PLC doesn't pay and therefore it costs zero. But you're the one that fundamentally understands there's simulation, or there's at least there's a distribution around this price expectation, and it triggers some of the time. And on average, that means that there's a projected PLC payment, even when the projected price is above the trigger. That's a hard
It's hard to,
it's a hard message to
right?
comprehend and a hard message to educate. I know for sure.
Yeah, and so that's, I mean, and we went and did some work with kind of decision making tools with our colleagues and try to say, hey, this is complicated, right? Don't just say, well, this expected price is a single point and it's 1 penny above the trigger and therefore it's going to be zero. Well, okay, there's also distributional issues, risk. How and then producers have to make a decision not only in terms of expected return, but under what conditions they're getting that return, and how do they want to evaluate it as risk as well too, right? That's it's supposed to be designed to be a little bit risk mitigating as well too, and so they have to include that in their
That's right. Well, and producers already have to make that decision every year about crop insurance and decide trade-offs between premium paid versus downside protection. Well, this matters too.
Yeah, and that's another place that we've been getting some questions when it comes to the upcoming Farm Bill debate as well too. We didn't talk about this, but when I was at when the Chief Economist is kind of the only non terminated, like doesn't have a specific end date on the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation Board of Directors. So I was the chair of the FCIC for 5 years, and I hadn't been involved heavily in crop insurance before that, except in some of the FAPRI modeling. But there's a lot of discussion within crop insurance today as well too, and some interesting things going on in terms of OBBBA subsidy rate changes. How will producers respond to increasing subsidy rates? Is it save money? Is it buy up coverage? It depends on where you're at. So getting some questions also on some around the edges of new crop insurance programs.
Yeah. Well, I also recall with Tharkin PLC, as I mentioned back in 2014, OBBBA did extend them to 2031, presuming that further Farm Bill deliberations here this year don't sort of revisit those details. Producers will have lived with ARC and PLC longer than anything since target price deficiency payment days. That almost is the new semi-permanent Farm Bill, even if it's not permanently authorized.
Yes.
In the analysis, how does one ever imagine moving away from a farm program that basically gives producers an annual choice between two different kinds of safety nets?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting in terms of, you're right, in terms of how do you move away from this program and achieve kind of some of the same results, and yet I see this, and maybe it will go nowhere. But this overall debate of do we need some fundamental changes in how we are approaching farm policy? Because you're right, this last step has been pretty evolutionary, not revolutionary. And so we have these there, and folks were making tweaks to them saying, hey, we don't want to just look at, the safety net trigger shouldn't be just receipts. It should be also with some understanding of the underlying cost basis, and let's put it out there.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's hard to envision. I don't know what it looks like, but I think there's also some understanding when folks talk about things like farmer bridge assistance and payments. That's separate from the Farm Bill. When folks think about how do payments like farmer bridge assistance make their way into the market, there's at least some dissatisfaction, I think, about how folks think that plays out. I don't know if it goes anywhere, because that'd be a monumental shift to think about this and crack that open. So I don't know if we have that kind of interest, but folks are at least trying to think through some of this process.
Are you getting requests on policies that address high input costs, or do you anticipate that you'll be getting some? Or do you think we moved away from that?
So I'll go back and I'll say at USDA we talk about, and again, I'll go back to this point of, the job is really, this is how it actually works. And that was particularly true at USDA, saying, I remember back in 2022, folks talking about, well, we need more slaughter capacity. We need more slaughter capacity for cattle. And I'm like, no, actually, we don't. Don't be careful what you're asking for. Just wait 18 months. And so at USDA, a lot of it was that doesn't necessarily do what you think it does. Or yes, that may do what you think it does, but it will be small, or the effect might be small, but policymakers still may decide they want to do that because they have some overarching objectives. I think there's been a lot of discussion about what can you do to try and resolve some input prices like fertilizer. I think you see some of that. I think you hear things about CVD, anti-dumping countervailing duty issues with Morocco disappearing, or how can we improve domestic production. I think that's a tough one to crack. I think it's a tough one to crack in the short run. So I think folks, I think sometimes trying to push a policy when you're in a crisis moment is not always the best thing to do, right? In terms of, because it's always let's solve it now. But that's, as an economist, that's a bit difficult to do.
One thing I've heard, I think maybe from USDA, or it's conventional wisdom, or it might be an urban legend, I don't know, is that economists sometimes are more effective in stopping less effective policies than helping more effective policies get implemented. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I think that people and it's not a bad job. I mean, it's just not as much of a fun job. It's not that it's a bad thing. I always liked hearing people's ideas. Well, we should try this, and I'd say, that might work. Understand that these are the costs associated with it. That could work. And so, part of the job was very much, don't do that. That's we've tried that. But I always loved hearing people's ideas about, hey, what if we pull this lever in some arcane spot in regulatory policy? Like, oh, that's great. Let's talk about that. Let's think about that, whether that's effective or not. And my job usually ends up being, well, here's what you might expect out of that. And that's okay. I actually enjoyed that quite a bit. So
yeah, I was going to ask a question on really back to the sort of the beginning. I'm interested in requests that you would get that you wouldn't be required to take up on. I mean, who legally has the authority to make a request to FAPRI, or
So,
do
and it's an
you
interesting
turn
process,
down
right? So,
people?
well, we take our marching orders from Congress, right?
Okay.
That's who we take our marching orders from. So, a member of the committee may call and say, "Here's an idea I'm thinking about. Go and it may be private or it may be very public. Here's some piece of legislation somebody's put forward. Can you cost this for me? Or we're thinking about we're going to put this forward. Cost it for us because we know that's going to come up in the debate." And I think that that's absolutely fine. I think sometimes it isn't necessarily, it may be that a constituency of the congressperson is saying, we want this. Can you go to get these folks to tell us so that we can get a respected or neutral view on what this policy would cost? So they may work with their Hill member to have the Hill member ask us, right? But ultimately, that's who we're responding to.
Now, does FAPRI, in your analysis, anything in the Farm Bill, which has multiple titles,
Yes.
is subject to something that you would estimate? Like, what about the food programs that represent
Yeah, and so I'd say we're not.
80%?
Yeah.
Where do you get you? I mean, do you come up with all the numbers in that regard, or do you have others that you rely? How's that work?
No, it's a great question because we can all talk about how SNAP is a huge part of the Farm Bill in terms of overall cost, right? It's a huge part of this. Now we can set aside the negotiation about, are you negotiating between absolute costs? Or are you negotiating between the ag part of it? And people are doing trade-offs in the ag part. So there's a first division between nutrition programs and ag programs. We could get into some of those details, but do we have as good of representation of SNAP and nutrition programs? No, we don't. And why is that? Because a lot of those costs come after the farm gate. That's at least a big part of it, right? What is it? 16 cents on the dollar of a food expenditure comes before the farm gate. The other 84 cents is after the farm gate. And so you've got this huge issue which costs determined. So costs of a SNAP program or participation rate determined at a macro level on the economy. So we try to do some of this quite simply saying, hey, what are the commodity drivers in food costs? Which is interesting because we could talk. An interesting discussion here as you go. For many years, for instance, so we would have like a CPI for food driven by commodity costs with some assumption about labor costs and other macro things which occur outside of our modeling system. And many years ago at ERS, they would have done their food price inflation indicator driven by commodity costs. During COVID, they abandoned that. And that makes a lot of sense during COVID because you think about the way, your structural, the number of cattle I have wasn't very related to the price of ground beef during COVID. And so it would have told you the wrong thing. But coming out of COVID, we now get back to HPAI, where eggs go to $8.53 a dozen. And you're back to some structural issues where understanding some of what the commodity push would be is important. So yes, we try to do and give a nod to what we're seeing from the farm side, but acknowledge that a lot of what goes on with those SNAP expenditures is driven by things outside of what we regularly do.
Ask another question too. Last April 1 was sort of a day that the president announced his new tariff proposals. What kind of scrambling did you have to do in FAPRI in order to react to those changes in your baseline?
So this kind of comes back to what's on paper. What do you know? It's kind of like the new China trade deal. I'm not, sometimes you're trying to interpret what is maybe only a sentence or two in terms of what a deal actually means or what a set of tariffs actually mean. So you try and, again, work your way through and say, what does this actually mean? So I think that's part of this cooperation with the North Dakota state folks. And we're thinking about, okay, if we get something new with China that acts kind of like the phase 1 trade agreement from 2018 or 2019. So when you're saying scrambling, how do we implement this? Well, again, Is it something like beef where trade might be much more additive? Or is it something like soybeans where it's just a shift of where beans are being sent around the world? And so certainly looking to see what this means, but without details, it's hard to make strong implementation of these things. But you see some movement towards something with the Chinese trade deal, at least some statements. So we feel like here we're trying to be prepared for that. So that was my example of saying what commodities is trade additive with China? What might China take? And what things are going to be, displacement of trade? Interestingly, from a policy standpoint, one of the other discussion points in there that folks I don't think they gloss over, but I didn't hear as much about is this trade board. These trade boards in these two countries. What's the function of these trade boards? Is this trade boards to facilitate trade? Do the Chinese have certain objectives about what they would want to take under that $17 billion? Do we have different objectives of what we might like to sell them under $17 billion? And so those are the things that we'll struggle with here. For instance, the US board might decide what we really want to be is additive here. So let's make them buy a bunch of commodities that are additive to our trade. And the Chinese might say, no, that's maybe costlier or exposes this industry. Let's instead do a lot of this through corn and bean and wheat trade where it's just displacement and moving things around. So these are the kinds of things we have to struggle with, and we're doing so because you can anticipate this will be a question in the future.
Yeah. This structure of trade globally, we're kind of replacing the World Trade Organization, where everybody gets together to set rules, to setting up, if we're going to go bilateral negotiations in most large cases, then you'll probably see something like trade boards for those countries being set up to negotiate changes, perhaps every so many years, kind of like farm bills. I don't know.
And it's much harder the decisions of a trade board are much harder to model than you think about our relative cost comparisons of producing soybeans with Brazil and how much are we going to export and what time of the year are we going to export it. It makes it much more difficult under our current structure, which isn't necessarily, again, focused on bilateral trade. And that's why I think we have to kind of think about, okay, our job is to handle certain things domestically, including some elements or some types of trade, and then partner with other folks if we really need to, or build something specific to the incident, which we did for last trade friction with China as well, too.
Is there a subject matter that you professionally would love to have FAPRI dig into, even if nobody petitions you to do so? Is there a pet project, if you will, that you dearly love to dig into?
Well, the good part of this answer is we largely do a lot of it already. So I'd love to do more with crop insurance. And I don't think necessarily that FAPRI requires us to do, that our specific area of expertise requires some of the elements of it, but some of the other PRCs do. And I like working with those folks. And so, I'd like to dig into more issues of crop insurance. I think it'd be always interesting for us to do more geographically narrow issues on livestock, including dairy and cattle. I am not a cattle economist. I would love to become a cattle economist, but I'm not. I very much love it. But I think that when I think about the things that maybe we need to do, we need to think about some of our trade exchanges. We need to think about some of our maybe subnational representation of dairy and cattle, do some more interesting things on crop insurance. I can think of lots of stuff where we could continue to try and make some advancements.
Panelists, last call.
Seth, I had commented during your role as chief economist, I had noted, I think I'd used the word, you might be the most outlooky of any of the chief economists that I recall, which is a complimentary way of saying you were more fond of, or at least more sort of attuned to the role of ag outlook in your role as anybody in that role previously. Yeah. Obviously, your position there also prevented you from saying specific things about the outlook process and the statistical procedures and the producer survey work and so forth. But once you left DC for Missouri, you had a little more freedom to start talking about how Outlook really works and how important it is. But you also inherited the role of directorship of FAPRI, which isn't specifically in the business of making Outlook forecasts. So yeah. How do you really feel about Outlook at this point? Is what I'm curious.
I guess the first part of that is to say, I've made most of my career by only saying about 1/2 of 1% of the things that go through my mind. So if you're looking for something profound, you probably won't get it here. But, I think most of it's like the E15 study where I think most of the misunderstanding comes from people that if you really understand the criteria of how things are done, then you can evaluate what is being presented. If you don't, then you will draw wrong conclusions, right? It's like I go back to the normal weather. Well, we assume normal weather, and people will say, yes, but it's a forecast El Nino. Okay. Does that guarantee that the South African corn crop will be smaller? No, it doesn't. And if we want to go back kind of to some of these things where NAS and maybe you're kind of alluding to a corn planted area for 2025, when you kind of get at some of those things, I always felt that my colleagues at NAS, it's like I always hated to be wrong. I hated to be wrong. I hated to be wrong. But my phone would only ring 50% of the time.
Yes.
Right? And
When
you
you
can
were
imagine
wrong
why.
that
When
way.
prices go down, my phone would ring. When prices would go, I gotta. I hope if you guys can cut this out if you want, but I got a story for you. There was a guy. My phone number used to be right in the WASD report, and the guy calls me up and he says, "You cost me $100,000 this month," and my assistant didn't want to send him to me. I said, "No, I'll talk to him," and he's like, "You cost me $100,000." Talk to him for 45 minutes and then he hangs up. I think he's okay. You understand. Next month, same thing. He calls me up and he goes, "You cost me $75,000 this month." Next month, prices go up. He doesn't call. He doesn't call. And my assistant would not give me his phone number because I was going to call him and I was going to say, "How much money did I make you this month?" Right. And so I think the first element is people need to understand what they've got. Second, NAS has to be transparent. NAS had a big miss. We can talk about whether that's pure statistical error. We're all math folks. You're going to make a flyer every once in a while. I think that statistical error all moved in the wrong direction for him, for Lance. So who's the guy at NAS who's running this. They all moved against him, so the crop kept getting bigger. But I think again, they need to be transparent. But they don't like being wrong, and they can't solve this problem without solid producer response. It's not the farmer's fault, but they can't be solved without their participation. And there's lots of reasons. Everybody loves their FSA office because they can see the direct connection to how it benefits them as a producer. There are benefits from you interacting with NAS. All those programs you like, crop insurance, etc., get their background, their start from the data that USDA collects and figures out how to make programs that work for you. But the connection is much more tenuous. So I think Outlook always has to be transparent, say what they're doing. But I think it is the premier market intelligence group in the world that works there.
That's a great note to end on. And Seth, thank you very much. This has been enlightening, informative, and glad to see you're back at work at FAPRI now and are looking forward to more good results coming from that institution here in the near and far future. We appreciate your time very much, Seth.
Thank you for having me.
And to our panelists, Jenny, Mark, and Brad, thanks to you as well. We'd remind you that Jenny also continues the podcast, which is entitled Smoke and Mirrors Ag Policy Unfiltered. You can find that at the agmanager.info website as well as the flinchbaughcenter.com website. And we are looking forward to another visit about all things agricultural policy next time. We would also remind you, check out that website for much more information, the Barry Flinchbaugh Center's website, flinchbaughcenter.com. With that, we'll bid you adieu. Eric Atkinson from Kansas State University. Thanks for joining us.